I didn't expect a single word on a piece of paper to make me feel this relieved, but the moment I saw it, I let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. Beta. I read it out loud, almost like I needed to hear it to believe it, and before I could stop myself, I let out a short laugh, light, easy, like something heavy had just been lifted off my shoulders. Well, that settles it, I said, folding the result in half without much care, already treating it like something unimportant, like it didn't carry the weight it probably should have, and I glanced up at Damien, expecting him to react the same way, expecting at least a hint of relief on his face, but he didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there watching me, his expression unreadable in a way that made me frown slightly. What? I asked, slipping the paper into my pocket. It's good news, I added, nudging his arm lightly as I stepped closer, casual, like this was obvious. I'm Beta, so no marking, no permanent bond, none of that Omega stuff we talked about. And I shrugged, like that explained everything, like that solved whatever quiet tension had been sitting between us for the past few months. It's easier this way, I said, more to convince myself than him. And for a second, he still didn't respond, just looked at me like he was waiting for something more, something I wasn't giving him, and I tilted my head, a little impatient now. Don't tell me you're disappointed, I added, half joking, half serious, because that didn't make sense to me. Not when this meant everything stayed exactly the way it was, nothing complicated, nothing permanent unless we chose it. And finally, he exhaled slowly, his gaze steady on mine. Is that what you think this means? He asked, his voice calm but quieter than usual, and I blinked, caught off guard for a second before I shrugged it off again. Yeah, I replied, like it was obvious, like there wasn't anything deeper to question. What else would it mean? And I stepped back, already turning toward the door, already moving forward like this conversation was over, like there was nothing left to figure out. Come on, I added over my shoulder, expecting him to follow like he always did. And after a brief pause, I heard his footsteps behind me, steady, familiar, and I didn't look back, didn't think about it any further, because to me, nothing had changed, everything was still in my control, still something I could walk away from if I needed to. And I held on to that feeling without questioning it, without realizing that while I was relieved I had avoided something permanent, Damien had never been looking for a way out in the first place. I knew something was wrong the moment I opened the door, not because of what I saw at first, but because of how quiet it was, the kind of silence that doesn't belong in a place that's supposed to be yours, the kind that makes you pause with your hand still on the handle, like your body is trying to warn you before your mind catches up. And then I stepped inside and saw him, sitting on my couch like he had every right to be there, like he hadn't just walked into a space that was supposed to be mine and Damien's. And for a second I thought I had the wrong apartment, that I'd somehow come home to the wrong floor, the wrong door, the wrong life. But then I saw Damien in the kitchen, calm as ever, pouring tea like this was just another normal afternoon, like nothing about this was out of place. And that was what made it worse, not the stranger, not the unfamiliar face that looked up at me with quiet curiosity, but the fact that Damien didn't look surprised to see me, didn't look guilty, didn't even look like he thought he needed to explain, and something in my chest tightened before I could stop it, sharp and immediate, because I knew Damien, I knew how he handled things, and this wasn't how someone acted when they'd done something wrong. This was how someone acted when they didn't think they had, and I hated that realization more than anything else. Hated the way it made everything feel like it was already slipping out of my control before I even had the chance to react. So I shut the door harder than I meant to and said the only thing that made sense in that moment. Who is he? And my voice came out sharper than I expected, cutting through the quiet in a way that made the air feel even heavier. But neither of them flinched. The stranger just glanced at Damien like he was waiting for permission to speak, and Damien, of course, didn't rush, didn't soften it, didn't try to ease me into whatever this was. He just set the cup down in front of him and said, evenly, his name is Noah. Like that was enough. Like a name could explain why someone else was sitting in our living room. And I almost laughed, because that wasn't an answer, not really not, to the question I was asking, not to the feeling already building in my chest. So I took a step forward, eyes locked on him, not even bothering to look at Noah anymore, because this wasn't about him, not really. Why is he here? And for a brief second, just a fraction of one, I thought I saw something shift in Damien's expression, not guilt, never that, but something quieter, something more calculating, like he was choosing his words. And then he said it, just like that, No hesitation, no attempt to soften the blow. He's my highest compatibility match. And the words didn't land all at once. They came in pieces, slow enough for me to understand exactly what he meant before I could stop myself from reacting to it. And I felt it. That drop in my stomach, that sudden hollow space where something solid used to be, because I knew what compatibility meant. I knew what that number implied. And before I could stop myself, before I could pretend it didn't matter, I asked, how high? Even though I already knew I wasn't going to like the answer, and Damien didn't look away, didn't hesitate, just met my eyes and said, 99.99%. Like he was stating a fact, like he was reading off something objective, something that didn't carry any emotional weight at all. And for a second, everything went quiet again, not in the room, but in my head, because that number meant something. It meant perfect, it meant inevitable, it meant everything I wasn't, and the worst part wasn't even hearing it. It was realizing he had known, that he had run the test, that he had taken this step without me, and then brought the result home like it was something we could just sit down and talk about over tea. And that's when the anger hit, sharp and immediate, cutting through the shock, because I had every right to be angry, every right to demand an explanation, because this wasn't casual, this wasn't undefined, we weren't something vague or temporary. We were together. We had been together long enough that things like this weren't supposed to happen without a conversation first, and I could feel it in the way my voice steadied. Not calmer, but colder, more deliberate. Then, what am I? And this time, he didn't answer right away, and that pause was worse than anything else, because it meant he was thinking, weighing something, and I didn't want to be something that needed to be weighed, not against anyone, not against a number, not against whatever this was supposed to be. And I almost expected him to say something complicated, something careful, something that would make this easier to understand, but instead, he said something simple, something that should have been reassuring and somehow wasn't. I brought him here because I'm not hiding anything from you, and I stared at him, because that wasn't what I had asked, because transparency didn't erase the fact that this had happened at all, didn't erase the image of someone else sitting where I was supposed to be, didn't erase the way my chest still felt tight, like something was pressing against it from the inside. You could have said no, I said, because that was the part that mattered, not the honesty, not the explanation, but the choice, the fact that he had allowed this to happen in the first place. And for the first time since I walked in, something shifted in his expression, not uncertainty, never that, but something firmer, something that made my stomach drop even before he spoke. I already did, and I frowned, because that didn't make sense, because Noah was still here, sitting in our living room, because the situation itself contradicted what he was saying, and maybe he saw that. Confusion on my face, because he added, just as steady as before, I chose you. And the words hung there, heavier than anything else he had said so far, because they should have been enough. They should have fixed this, should have made everything snap back into place, but they didn't. Not completely, because the way he said it wasn't soft, wasn't uncertain, wasn't emotional in the way I needed it to be. It was a statement, a decision, something already finalized, and that was the problem, because I didn't feel chosen, not in that moment. I felt decided, like this had been settled without me, like I had been placed somewhere rather than held there, and before I could stop myself, the words came out, sharp and unfiltered. That's not love. And for the first time, his brows pulled together just slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to confusion, like he genuinely didn't understand what I meant. And maybe he didn't. Maybe this was how he saw it, how he had always seen it. And that realization made everything worse, because it meant this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was just him. That's control. I added, quieter this time, but no less certain, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room thick enough that even Noah seemed to shrink back into the background, like he knew this wasn't something he was supposed to be part of anymore. And then Damien turned to him, just briefly, and said something low enough that I didn't catch every word, but I understood enough that this was over, that whatever connection had brought Noah here wasn't going any further. And Noah nodded, standing up with a quiet apology that felt almost unnecessary, because he wasn't the one who had done anything wrong. Not really. And within minutes, he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that left the apartment quieter than before, but not in the same way, not neutral, not empty, but tense, stretched thin between the two of us, because now there was no distraction, no third presence to absorb any of it, Just me and Damien standing there, facing each other with everything still unresolved, everything still sitting between us like something neither of us quite knew how to move past, and I realized, standing there in the aftermath of something that hadn't even lasted an hour, that he was right. He hadn't betrayed me. Not in the way I had expected, not in the way that would have made this simple, and somehow that made it worse, because if he had, I would have known what to do. I would have had a reason to walk away, a clear line to point to and say this is where it broke. But instead, all I had was this complicated, uncomfortable truth that he had been honest, that he had chosen me, and that for some reason, that didn't make me feel safe at all. I didn't understand why it unsettled me so much until I forced myself to replay it. Not just what he said, but everything that happened before that. The parts one had brushed past in the moment because I was too focused on the fact that someone else was sitting in our living room. Because if I looked closer, if I slowed it down, there had been something off about Damien even before I walked in. Something subtle enough that I hadn't noticed it right away, but clear enough that once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The way his shoulders had been just a little too stiff when I first looked toward the kitchen. The way his hand had paused for half a second longer than usual as he set the cup down in front of Noah. The way his gaze had lingered on him, not with warmth, not with interest, but with a kind of sharp focus I had never seen directed at anyone else before, and it hadn't been obvious. Not the kind of reaction that would draw attention on its own. But Damien wasn't someone who slipped, not even in small ways. He was controlled in everything he did, precise down to the smallest movement. And that was exactly why it stood out now that I was thinking about it. Because those tiny inconsistencies didn't belong to him. They didn't fit the version of him I knew. And once that realization settled in, everything else started to rearrange itself around it. The test, the number, the decision to bring Noah here. It all traced back to that one point, that one moment where something must have shifted just enough to push him out of his usual certainty. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this hadn't been planned from the beginning. This hadn't been some calculated move he had been sitting on for weeks. It had been a reaction, a response to something that caught him off guard. And that was the part that stayed with me, because Damien didn't react. He decided, he chose, he controlled, except this time, something had made him act first and stabilize later, and that difference, that reversal, was what made my chest feel tight in a way I couldn't explain. Because if there had been a moment where he wasn't in control, even briefly, even slightly, then what did that mean for everything else I had been relying on? What did that say about the certainty I thought I had? And I found myself going back to the way he had said, I needed to know. The way there had been no hesitation in his voice, no apology, just a quiet necessity that made it clear this wasn't optional to him. This wasn't something he could ignore once it had started, and that thought settled deeper than anything else, because it meant there were parts of him that operated outside of choice, outside of intention, parts that didn't wait for him to decide. And I exhaled slowly, trying to steady the way my thoughts were starting to spiral, but it didn't help, because once that possibility exists, once you let yourself consider it, it doesn't go away, it just grows, it stretches into places you didn't expect, into questions you don't want to answer, like what happens next time. What happens if there's another Noah, another trigger, another moment where something in him reacts before he can contain it? And this time there isn't a clean resolution. This time it's not something he can bring into the open and cut off neatly. This time it's just there, lingering, pulling at him in ways even he might not fully understand. And I hated that thought, hated how easily it fit into everything I had just seen, because it made sense in a way that was hard to argue against. And the worst part was, it didn't even require him to change, didn't require him to stop choosing me, because that wasn't the issue. The issue was that there were things beyond that choice, things that could coexist with it, things that didn't cancel it out but still threatened it in ways that felt just as real. And I realized then that this wasn't about trust in the way I had always understood it. It wasn't about whether Damien would betray me on purpose. It was about whether there were situations where intention didn't matter as much as instinct, where wanting something wasn't enough to override everything else. And that was a different kind of uncertainty, one I didn't know how to handle, because I had always told myself that as long as someone chose you, as long as they stayed, that was enough. That was what mattered. But now I wasn't so sure. Now I was seeing the edges of something I couldn't fully control, couldn't predict, and for someone like me, someone who had spent most of my life trying to avoid exactly that kind of vulnerability, that realization didn't pull me closer. It pushed me back, slowly at first, just a shift in the way I looked at him, a hesitation that hadn't been there before, but it grew the longer I stood there. The more I let those thoughts take shape, because the truth was, I didn't know what to do with a love that strong if it wasn't stable. I didn't know how to trust something that could be shaken, even for a moment. And the idea of building anything on top of that, of letting myself depend on it, felt more dangerous than I was willing to admit. And I could feel that instinct kicking in, that familiar urge to create distance before something could be taken from me, to step back before I had the chance to lose it. Because if there was even a possibility that one day I wouldn't be enough, that something outside of his control could pull him away from me even briefly, then maybe it was better not to let myself get too attached in the first place. Maybe it was safer to keep one foot out, to remind myself that nothing is permanent, that nothing ever really is. And as I stood there, watching him the way I hadn't before, noticing the steadiness that used to reassure me now feeling almost too deliberate, too controlled, like something held in place rather than something naturally unshakable, I realized that the relief I had felt earlier, the sense of safety I had clung to when I found out I was a beta, had been built on the wrong thing entirely, because it wasn't. The bond one was afraid of, it wasn't the idea of being tied to him that scared me. It was the possibility that even something that strong, something that certain, could still be lost. And once that thought settled in, it didn't make me want to hold on tighter. It made me want to let go before I ever had the chance to fall far enough to break. I didn't notice when it started, not exactly, because nothing about Damien changed in a way I could point to, nothing obvious enough to call out, nothing clear enough to say this is different, this is wrong. It was just more of everything he had always been, more attention, more presence, more certainty, and maybe that was why it took me so long to recognize it, because on the surface, it still looked like care, still sounded like concern, still felt like the same steady devotion I had once leaned into without question. But now, after everything that had happened, after the way he had looked at Noah, after the way he had said he needed to know, I couldn't experience it the same way anymore. I couldn't ignore the weight behind it. And suddenly, all those small things I used to accept without thinking started to stand out, like the way he texted me more often when I was out, not asking where I was in a way that sounded demanding, but checking in just enough that I couldn't forget he was there. Or the way he adjusted his schedule without telling me, canceling things so he could be home when I got back, like it wasn't even something that needed discussion, like it was just natural that his time should align with mine. And before, I had told myself it was sweet, that it meant he cared, but now it felt like something else, something tighter, something that closed in instead of opening up space. And I started to feel it in places I hadn't before, in the way I hesitated before answering his messages, in the way I lingered outside a few seconds longer before going inside, like I needed that extra moment to breathe before stepping back into a space where everything felt just a little too controlled. And I hated that feeling, hated that it had crept in without me realizing it, because nothing he was doing was wrong, not technically, not in a way I could call out without sounding unreasonable. And that made it worse, because it meant I couldn't argue against it, couldn't push back, without questioning my own reaction. Couldn't tell if the problem was him, or if it was just me overthinking everything after what had happened. And maybe part of me wanted it to be that, wanted to believe I was the one making it bigger than it was, because the alternative meant admitting that something between us had shifted in a way I didn't know how to fix. And I tried, I really did, to go back to how things were, to respond the same way, to act like nothing had changed, but it didn't work. Because once you see something, once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. And the awareness stayed, settled somewhere in the back of my mind, turning everything just slightly off, like a picture that's been tilted a few degrees, and you can't stop noticing it. And it wasn't just the way he watched me more closely now, or the way his attention seemed sharper, more focused, like he was always aware of where I was, what I was doing. It was the way he touched me, not differently, not in a way anyone else would notice, but in a way that felt more deliberate, more certain, like he was grounding something, confirming something, and I found myself pulling back sometimes without meaning to, just a fraction, just enough that he would pause for a second before letting his hand drop, and those moments lingered longer than they should have, because they made the distance between us feel real in a way it hadn't before, and I could tell he noticed. Of course he noticed, Damien always noticed. But he didn't say anything, didn't question it, didn't push, he just adjusted, subtly, seamlessly, like he was recalibrating around me. And that should have made it better, should have reassured me. but it didn't, because it felt like he was adapting in a way that still kept everything centered on me, still kept me within reach, and the more I became aware of it, the harder it was to ignore the pressure building underneath it. Not something he said directly, not something he demanded, but something implied in the way he talked about the future, in the way he brought it up like it was still there, still waiting, just postponed, not removed, like the shift from Omega to Beta hadn't changed anything in his mind. And that realization sat heavier than anything else, because it meant the boundary I thought I had gained wasn't real, that the space I thought I had carved out for myself didn't exist in the way I needed it to. And I remember one night, sitting across from him at the table, barely touching the food in front of me, because my thoughts were somewhere else entirely, and he looked at me for a second longer than usual before asking, "Did you eat earlier?" And the question was simple, normal, something he had asked 100 times before, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like he was tracking something, measuring something, and I forced a small shrug. "I'm not that hungry." And he nodded, like he accepted that. But a few minutes later he pushed the plate slightly closer to me, not insisting, not telling me to eat, just placing it there, and I stared at it for a second longer than I should have, because it felt like a decision had been made without me again, a small one, insignificant on its own, but part of a pattern I was starting to see everywhere, and I picked up the fork just to break the moment, just to avoid saying something that would turn this into an argument I couldn't fully explain, and that was the problem. I couldn't explain it, couldn't put into words why something so small felt so heavy. Why something that used to make me feel taken care of now made me feel like I was being watched too closely, held too tightly, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it built, quietly, steadily, until it wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was pressure, the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't go away, the kind that makes you feel like you're losing space even when nothing around you has physically changed, and I realized, slowly, reluctantly, that it wasn't just what he was doing, it was how I was reacting to it, how everything felt amplified now, how every gesture carried more weight than before, because I couldn't stop thinking about that moment, about the possibility of him losing control, about the idea that no matter how certain he was, no matter how much he believed in choosing me, there were still things that could disrupt that, and that. Fear didn't make me hold on to him tighter. It made me want to create distance, to take back some control for myself, to remind myself that I wasn't completely wrapped up in something I couldn't step away from. And as that thought settled in, quiet but persistent, I started to realize that the feeling growing inside me wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was something closer to suffocation, not because he was doing anything overtly wrong, but because everything he did was just a little too much. Now, just enough to make me aware of it, just enough to make me question it, and just enough to make me wonder if this was what it would feel like to stay, to really stay, in a love that didn't loosen its grip even when you needed it to. I didn't realize how bad it sounded until he said it out loud. Not in the moment, not when I was laughing it off like I always did, but later, when someone else looked at me like I was the problem. "You really don't see it, do you?" my friend said, arms crossed as they leaned back against the couch, watching me with an expression that was way too serious for what I thought was just normal relationship stuff, and I frowned immediately, already defensive. "See what?" I shot back, grabbing my drink like I needed something to do with my hands, because I didn't like the way this was going, didn't like the way they were looking at me like I had done something wrong, and they let out a short breath, shaking their head slightly. "The way you treat him," they said, and I almost laughed at that, because that didn't make sense to me. "Not at all. I treat him fine," I replied, quick, automatic, like it didn't even need to be questioned, and they raised an eyebrow. "Unimpressed. Fine?" They repeated, like the word didn't belong there, like it didn't match what they had seen, and before I could argue, they continued, their voice sharper now. "You call him in the middle of the night and expect him to drop everything just to come get you." And I rolled my eyes, already brushing it off. "He doesn't have to come," I said, shrugging like that solved it, like it made it okay. "He chooses to." And that had always been my logic, always the way I justified it, but they didn't let it slide, didn't back down the way most people did. "Yeah, because he cares about you." They shot back, stepping closer now, like they needed me to actually hear it this time. "And you know that, which is why you keep doing it." And that hit a little differently. Not enough to admit it, but enough to make me look away for a second, annoyed more than anything else. And before I could respond, they kept going, not giving me time to recover. "And that time you made him wait outside in the rain," they added, and I scoffed immediately. I didn't make him. I said, sharper this time, because that one always sounded worse when someone else said it out loud. I told him where I was. He could have left. And even as I said it, the memory flashed in my head, him standing there, soaked through, unmoving, and I pushed it aside before it could settle, before it could mean anything more than I wanted it to. He stayed because you told him to, my friend replied, their voice lower now, but no less firm, and I clenched my jaw slightly, because I didn't like where this was going, didn't like how they were framing it like something serious instead of what it was supposed to be. Just us, just how things worked between us. That's just how we are. I muttered, weaker than before, and they shook their head again, this time slower, more deliberate. No, they said, that's how you are. And that landed harder than anything else they had said so far, because it shifted the focus completely, took it off him and put it entirely on me. And for a second, I didn't have an immediate comeback, didn't have something ready to deflect it, and they didn't stop there, didn't give me the chance to recover. You get jealous if he even talks to someone else, they continued. But you flirt with whoever you want and expect him to just deal with it. And I let out a short, frustrated breath, because that wasn't fair, it wasn't the same. That's different, I said quickly, even though I couldn't explain exactly why, and they just looked at me, waiting, like they knew I didn't have a real answer, like they were giving me the chance to hear how that sounded. And when I didn't say anything else, they exhaled slowly, their tone softening just slightly, but not enough to make it easier. You know he's not like that, they said, he's serious about you. And I looked away again, my grip tightening slightly around the glass in my hand, because I did know that. Of course I knew that. I had always known that. I just never thought about what it meant, not fully, not in the way they were forcing me to now, and for a moment. The room felt quieter than before, heavier in a way I didn't like, and I shook my head slightly, brushing it off before it could go any further, before it could turn into something I had to actually face. You're overthinking it, I muttered, even though it didn't sound convincing anymore, not even to me. And before they could say anything else, before they could push it further, I pulled out my phone, already dialing a number I knew by heart, because this was easier, this was familiar, this was something I understood, and it rang once before he picked up, like he always did. Where are you? I said, skipping any greeting, any explanation, falling back into the same pattern without thinking, and there was a brief pause on the other end before his voice came through, calm, steady, send me your location. And just like that, everything settled back into place, like it always did, like nothing had changed at all. I told myself the call didn't mean anything, that it was just habit, just the easiest solution in a moment when I didn't feel like thinking too much. But the truth was I already knew what would happen the second I pressed his name. And when he answered, calm and immediate like he always did, something in my chest tightened in a way I couldn't quite explain, because no matter how much had shifted between us, that part hadn't changed. He still came when I called, still showed up like it wasn't even a question, and when I stepped outside and saw his car pull up minutes later, headlights cutting clean through the dark, I felt that same familiar pull I had always felt, that quiet certainty that no matter what else happened, he would be there, and maybe that was exactly what made everything feel more complicated now, because as I got in and the door closed behind me, the space between us felt different, not distant exactly, but heavier, like something unspoken was sitting there with us. And for a while neither of us said anything, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence as he pulled away from the curb, his attention fixed on the road, steady as ever. And I found myself watching him instead of looking out the window, noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way his grip on the steering wheel was just slightly tighter than usual, the way his jaw set for a second before relaxing again, like he was holding something back, and I almost said something then, almost broke the silence just to get rid of that feeling. But the words didn't come, or maybe I didn't want them to, because once I started, I wouldn't know how to stop. And it wasn't until we were already halfway home that I finally spoke, my voice quieter than I expected. I'm not going to present as Omega. And the words felt heavier out loud, more final, more real. And for a moment, I thought that might change something, might shift the direction of everything we had been circling around. But Damien didn't react the way I thought he would, didn't pause, didn't hesitate, didn't even look surprised. He just nodded slightly, like it was something he had already accounted for, something that didn't disrupt whatever he had already decided. And that reaction, that calm acceptance, unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant this didn't matter to him in the way I thought it did. that the boundary I had been holding onto wasn't really a boundary at all, and I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, though there was nothing funny about it. Doesn't that change anything for you? I asked, turning slightly toward him, waiting for something, anything that felt uncertain, but his answer came just as steady as always. No. And that single word sat between us, heavier than anything else he could have said, because it wasn't dismissive, it wasn't careless, it was absolute, and I frowned slightly, because I didn't understand how it could be that simple. How something that felt so significant to me could mean so little in the way. He saw things. You said you wanted. I stopped, the rest of the sentence catching in my throat before I forced it out anyway. A family. And this time, he did glance at me, just briefly, before returning his attention to the road. And when he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, not softer, not warmer, but more grounded, more certain in a way that made my chest tighten again. I still do, he said. And for a second, I just stared at him, because that didn't make sense. Not with what I knew, not with what I had been told. That's not possible, I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. But he didn't react to that either, didn't argue, didn't correct me immediately, just took a slow breath before saying, "It is," and that was when something in me shifted, not understanding, not acceptance, but a kind of unease that settled deeper than anything else had so far. Because there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just quiet certainty, and I shook my head slightly, more to ground myself than anything else. How? I asked, and for the first time since I got into the car, there was a pause, not long, not enough to break his composure, but enough that I noticed it, enough that it felt deliberate. And then he said it, simply, like he was stating something obvious, something that didn't need explanation. I'm presenting as enigma. And the word didn't land right away, didn't register fully until a second later when everything I knew about it caught up with me, and my breath caught before I could stop it. Because that changed things, not in the way I had hoped, not in the way that would create distance, but in the exact opposite way, because enigma meant something else entirely, something that didn't follow the same rules, something that didn't need me to be Omega to do what he had always planned. And suddenly the space in the car felt smaller, tighter, like the air itself had shifted, and I turned toward him fully now, searching his face for something, anything that would make this feel less certain, less real, but all I found was the same calm expression, the same unwavering steadiness that had always been there. And that was when it hit me, not all at once, but enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore, that nothing I had been holding on to actually changed anything, not my result, not the label, not the boundary I thought I had gained, because Damien had already moved past it, already found a way to keep everything exactly where he wanted it, and I leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly as I tried to steady the sudden rush of thoughts that came with that realization. Because this wasn't just about the future anymore, it wasn't just about something that might happen later. It was about the fact that there was no version of this where I wasn't part of it, no version where I could step outside of what he had already decided, and I felt it then, that same tightness from before, sharper now, more defined, like something closing in around me without actually touching me, and I looked away, focusing on the passing lights outside the window just to give myself something else to hold on to, something that wasn't him, but it didn't help, because the awareness was already there, settled too deep to ignore, and by the time we pulled into the building, I hadn't said anything else, hadn't found the words for what I was feeling, and maybe that was part of the problem, because without words, without confrontation, everything just stayed where it was, unchallenged, unspoken. And when we stepped inside, everything looked exactly the same as before, the same space, the same layout, the same quiet familiarity, but it didn't feel the same. Not anymore. And it wasn't until later, after the initial tension had settled into something quieter, something harder to define, that I started noticing the changes, small at first, almost unremarkable, like the way the front door clicked differently when it closed, heavier, more secure, and I frowned slightly, testing the handle without thinking, only to realize it didn't give the same way it used to. And when I glanced back at Damien, he didn't look surprised, didn't try to hide it, just said evenly, "I had the locks replaced." Like it was the most normal thing in the world, and maybe it was, maybe it could have been, but the timing made something in my chest tighten again. Why? I asked, and he met my gaze without hesitation. "There have been people following lately," he said. "It's safer this way." And the explanation made sense. It was logical, reasonable, something I couldn't easily argue against, and yet it didn't fully settle the unease that had already taken root, and I nodded slowly, more out of habit than agreement, letting it pass for now. But then there were other things, subtle, easy to overlook if I hadn't already been paying closer attention, like the small black device in the corner of the living room that I didn't remember being there before, or the notification on my phone about location sharing that I was sure I hadn't turned on myself. And each time I noticed something new, the same thought surfaced, quiet but persistent, and I tried to push it down, tried to rationalize it the way he did, the way he explained everything so calmly, so reasonably, but it didn't fully go away, and eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore, couldn't keep pretending it was nothing, and I found him in the kitchen one night, standing exactly where he always stood, like nothing had changed, and for a second I just watched him, the familiarity of it clashing with everything else I had been noticing, before I finally spoke. Why are there cameras in the apartment? And he didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, just turned slightly toward me. Expression steady, security, he said. There have been paparazzi around lately. And again, it made sense, again, it sounded reasonable, and I hated that. Hated that I couldn't immediately call it out as wrong, because that would have been easier. That would have given me something clear to push against. But instead, I was left standing there with something that felt wrong without being obviously so, and I crossed my arms slightly, the movement instinctive, protective, and the tracking? I added, and for a second, just a second, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, not guilt, not quite, but awareness, before it smoothed over just as quickly. It helps me know you're safe, he said, stepping a little closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to close some of the distance. You've been going out more lately. And there it was again, that calm reasoning, that quiet justification that made everything sound like care instead of control, and I shook my head slightly, because I didn't know how to argue with that, didn't know how to explain that it didn't feel like safety. It felt like something else entirely, something tighter, something that didn't leave much room for me to move. It feels like you're watching me, I said finally, the words coming out quieter than I intended, but they still hung there between us, heavier than I expected, and for the first time, he softened, just slightly, his voice lowering as he reached out, fingers brushing lightly against my wrist, grounding, familiar. You're overthinking, he said gently, and there was no edge to it, no dismissal, just quiet reassurance, the kind that would have worked on me before, the kind that would have made me doubt my own reaction instead of his actions, and maybe part of me still wanted to believe it, wanted to accept that explanation and let everything settle back into something easier, something familiar. But the feeling didn't go away, didn't loosen its grip the way it used to, and as I stood there, caught between what he was telling me and what I was starting to feel, more clearly than ever, I realized that this wasn't something I could just brush off anymore. Not completely, not like before, even if I didn't yet know what to do with it. I knew something was off the second he stepped closer and didn't stop, not at the usual distance, not where it still felt like him, but closer than that. Too close, like the space between us didn't exist anymore, and my body reacted before my thoughts did, a sharp tension running through me as I took a step back. Damien, wait. I said quickly, my voice tighter than I intended, but he didn't stop immediately. His gaze fixed on me in a way that felt different, too focused, too intense, like I wasn't just someone he was looking at but something he was locked onto. And that was when it hit me, not just the shift in him, but the pressure in the air, something heavier, something I couldn't explain but couldn't ignore either. Hey, I said again, sharper this time, raising my hand slightly between us as if that would create space. Stop. And this time he did pause, just for a second, like he was catching himself, like he was trying to hold on to control that was slipping just slightly out of reach, and he exhaled slowly, his voice lower when he spoke. I'm fine. And I shook my head immediately, because that wasn't true. I could feel it. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. No, you're not, I replied, backing up another step until I felt the wall behind me, grounding me just enough to keep from panicking. What is this? And there was a brief silence, a flicker of something in his expression, something strained, before he answered. It's happening, he said quietly, and I frowned, my chest tightening as the meaning started to settle in. What is? I asked, even though part of me already knew, and he held my gaze, steady despite everything else. Enigma, he said, and the word landed heavier than anything else in the room, because it wasn't just a label, It was everything that came with it, everything I had thought I avoided, and I shook my head instinctively, like I could push it away just by denying it. No, I said under my breath. That doesn't change anything. But it did. It changed everything, because I could feel it now, the intensity building instead of fading. The way he stepped closer again like distance wasn't something he could tolerate, and my pulse spiked, my hand pressing back against the wall as I tried to hold my ground. Stop, I said again, louder this time. I'm not an Omega. And the words came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't take them back, couldn't, because they were the only thing I had to hold on to right now. You can't treat me like one. And for a second, he stilled again, his expression tightening slightly like the words had reached him. And when he spoke, his voice softened just a little. I know, he said, and that should have helped, should have eased the tension building in my chest. But it didn't, because knowing didn't change the way this felt, didn't change the way everything was pressing in around me. Then stop acting like it. I shot back, my voice breaking slightly at the edges as frustration and something else I didn't want to name pushed forward. If you need someone like that, if you need someone you can mark, someone who can give you what you want, then go find Noah. And the moment the words left my mouth, the room went still, not quiet, not calm, just still, like everything had locked into place around that sentence. And for a second, I thought I had gone too far, thought this was where he would snap, where everything would finally break. But he didn't. He didn't react the way I expected. Instead, he took a slow breath, forcing himself back into control piece by piece. And when he looked at me again, his gaze was steady, grounded in a way that felt almost at odds with everything else. There is no one else, he said, and the certainty in his voice hit harder than any anger would have. There never will be. And I shook my head, because I didn't know what to do with that, didn't know how to respond to something so absolute when I felt like I was barely holding things together. You don't know that, I said, but it sounded weaker than I meant it to, and he didn't waver, didn't look away. I do, he replied simply, and then, after a brief pause, I already said it publicly, and that made my chest tighten all over again, because I remembered the interviews, the way he had said it so easily, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like it was permanent. I have someone, he continued, his voice steady, and I'm not changing that. And suddenly it wasn't just him anymore. It was everything outside of this room pressing in too. The people, the attention, the fact that this wasn't something I could just walk away from without consequences, and the pressure doubled, sharp and suffocating. And I shook my head, backing up even though I had nowhere left to go, my voice breaking completely this time. I can't do this, I said, and the words felt final even as they left my mouth. I can't breathe around you anymore. And for the first time since this started, something in his expression shifted, not anger, not frustration, just something quieter, something that looked a lot like hurt. And that was worse than anything else, because even now, even like this, he wasn't pushing me away, wasn't walking out. He was still there, still choosing me, and that only made everything feel heavier, because I didn't know how to meet him there, didn't know how to give him what he was asking for without losing something I wasn't ready to lose. I thought it would hit all at once. Something obvious, something I wouldn't be able to ignore, but it didn't. It started small, quiet enough that I could pretend it was nothing, just a bad morning, just something I ate, and I leaned over the sink, gripping the edge as the nausea came sharp and sudden, my breath uneven as I waited for it to pass. Damn it, I muttered under my breath, rinsing my mouth quickly like that would reset everything, like it would make it stop. And for a second it did, the feeling fading just enough that I could stand up straight again, brushing it off like it wasn't worth thinking about. But it came back the next day, and the day after that, always at the worst times, always when I wasn't ready for it. And by the time I finally said something, I already knew what it might be. I just didn't want to hear it out loud, didn't want it to become real in a way I couldn't undo. And the clinic felt too familiar when I walked in. The same quiet, the same sterile air, and I sat there longer than I needed. My foot tapping lightly against the floor as I avoided looking at anything directly, until the doctor finally spoke, calm, matter of fact. The result is positive, and that was it. No build-up, no room to pretend otherwise, just a simple confirmation that settled heavy in my chest. And for a second, I didn't react, didn't say anything, just stared ahead like I needed time to catch up. And when I left, everything outside looked exactly the same. People moving, cars passing, nothing changed. except the fact that everything had, and by the time I got home, Damien was already there. Of course he was. And the moment he saw me, his expression shifted immediately. "What happened?" he asked, stepping closer, his voice softer than usual, and I hesitated for half a second before answering. Because once I said it, there was no taking it back. "I'm pregnant," I said, and the words felt strange in my mouth, heavier than they should have been, and he didn't freeze, didn't react the way I expected, just held my gaze for a moment before nodding slightly, steady, grounded. "Okay," he said, like it was something manageable, something we could handle, and that calmness hit me harder than anything else, because it didn't match what I was feeling at all. "Okay," I repeated, letting out a short breath, my frustration rising faster than I could control. "That's it?" And he frowned slightly, not defensive, just focused. "We'll figure it out," he said, reaching for me without thinking, and I stepped back before he could touch me, the movement sharper than I intended. "Stop," I said, and the word came out quick, edged with something I couldn't quite hold back. "You don't get to just decide that." And his hand stilled midair before dropping back to his side, his expression shifting just slightly. "I'm not deciding anything," he replied, still calm, still measured, and that only made it worse, because it felt like he was, like everything was already moving forward without me. "You are," I shot back, my voice rising. "You act like this is fine, like I'm just supposed to go along with it." And even as I said it, part of me knew I was pushing too hard, but I couldn't stop, couldn't pull it back once it started, and he didn't interrupt, didn't argue, just stood there listening. And that made the frustration twist sharper in my chest, because I had nothing to push against. "This isn't what I wanted," I added, quieter now, but no less tense. "I didn't choose this." And for a moment, something in his expression softened, just slightly. "I know," he said, and his voice was gentler now. "It's a lot." And I let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking my head. "Then stop acting like it's not," I replied, turning away before I could say something. Worse, before I could lose control completely, and for a while after that. Things didn't settle, they didn't get easier the way I thought they might. They just shifted, my reactions sharper than they should have been, every small thing setting me off in ways I couldn't predict, couldn't control, and Damien adjusted without hesitation, softer, more careful, like he was constantly recalibrating around me, making sure I didn't have to deal with anything alone, bringing me food, reminding me to rest, staying close without pushing too much, and that should have helped. It should have made things easier, but it didn't, because the more he did, the more I felt like I was the one losing control, the one reacting too much, and it only made everything worse, because I could see it, could hear it in my own voice when I snapped at him over something small, something that didn't matter, and even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were too much, knew I was being unfair, but I still couldn't stop, couldn't take them back fast enough, and he never pushed back, never matched my tone, just stayed steady, absorbing it in a way that made the silence afterward heavier than anything else. And that was the worst part, not just that I was hurting him, but that I could see it happening and still couldn't seem to stop myself, like something in me was slightly out of sync, reacting before I had time to think. And when things quieted down again, when the tension faded just enough for me to breathe normally, I would sit there and replay it. The way I spoke, the way I pushed him away for no real reason, and the guilt settled in slow but certain, because I knew better, I did. I just couldn't seem to act like it in the moment, and that realization stayed with me longer than anything else, not loud, not overwhelming, just there, persistent, because it meant this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me too, and I didn't know how to fix that yet. I knew it was going to go wrong before it actually did, not because of anything specific he said, but because everything already felt too tight, like I had been holding something in for too long and it was starting to crack. And the moment he asked, "Did you sleep okay?" in that same calm, careful tone, something in me snapped, sharper than it should have been. "Why do you keep asking me that?" I shot back, my voice rising before I could stop it, and he paused, just slightly, like he hadn't expected that reaction, but he didn't push back, didn't match my tone, just answered the way he always did, steady, controlled. Because I care. And that only made it worse, because I was tired of that answer, tired of everything being explained the same way. "You always say that," I replied, letting out a short breath, pacing a step away before turning back to him. "But you never actually listen." And even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true, But I couldn't stop, couldn't pull it back once it started, and he didn't interrupt, didn't argue, just stood there watching me. And that silence made something twist tighter in my chest, because it felt like I was the only one losing control. You already decided everything. I continued, the words coming faster now. About this, about us, about the future. You just expect me to go along with it like I don't have a choice. And for a second, there was nothing, just that. Same quiet space between us, before he spoke again, his voice still calm but heavier now. You always have a choice. And I let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking my head. Do I? I asked, stepping closer again, my voice lower but sharper, because it doesn't feel like it. And this time, he didn't answer right away, didn't fill the silence the way he usually did, and something about that hesitation pushed me further instead of stopping me. You wanted this, I said, louder now, more certain. All of it, the control, the way everything revolves around you knowing where I am, what I'm doing. And I gestured toward myself without thinking, even this. And the moment I said it, I felt it, the shift, subtle but real, like something had finally crossed a line. But it was too late to stop, too late to take it back. This isn't something we chose together, I added, my voice tightening. This is something you made happen. And the silence that followed wasn't heavy, wasn't tense, it was empty. And that was worse, because when he finally spoke, his voice had changed, not louder, not colder, just distant. Is that what you think? He asked, and I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out, because I didn't know how to fix it anymore, didn't know how to pull it back from where it had landed, and he nodded slightly when I didn't answer, like that silence was enough, like it told him everything he needed to know, and when he looked at me again, something was missing, something I hadn't realized I relied on until it was gone. Then maybe I should stop, he said, and I frowned, confusion cutting through everything else. Stop what? I asked, but even as I said it, my chest tightened, because I already knew, and he didn't hesitate this time, didn't soften it. Stop holding on to something you don't want, he said, and the words landed harder than anything else had, because they were simple, because they were true in a way I couldn't argue with. You don't have to stay, he continued, his voice steady. Not because of me, not because of this. And his gaze flickered briefly toward me before settling again. And not because of the child. And that was when it hit, really hit, because this wasn't an argument anymore. This wasn't something that would reset the way it always had before, and I shook my head immediately, stepping forward like I could stop it just by closing the distance. That's not what I meant, I said quickly, but he didn't move, didn't meet me halfway, just stood there, grounded in a way that made everything feel final. I'll take responsibility, he added, and the words felt heavier than anything else, because they weren't about us anymore. They were about obligation, about something separate from whatever we had been before, and for a second, neither of us moved, the space between us wider than it had ever been, and I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to fix something I had just broken myself, and eventually, he turned away, not abruptly, not angrily, just quietly, like he had already decided, and the sound of the door closing behind him was softer than I expected, but it echoed anyway, settling into the silence he left behind, and I stood there for a moment, unmoving, like if I didn't react, it wouldn't be real, but nothing changed, nothing shifted back into place, and slowly, the apartment started to feel different, not just quiet, but empty in a way I couldn't ignore, and I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to move, my steps dragging slightly as I walked further in, my eyes landing on the small things I used to complain about, the camera in the corner, the lock on the door, details I had once called suffocating, and now they just sat there, still, meaningless without him behind them, and my hand moved automatically toward my phone, my thumb hovering over his name like it always did, like all I had to do was press it, and everything would go back to normal, and I almost did, almost. Gave in to that instinct. But his voice cut through it again, clear, steady, you don't have to stay, and my hand stilled, the movement stopping before I slowly lowered it, because this wasn't the same, this wasn't something I could fix like that, not this time, and I swallowed, setting the phone down as the silence settled heavier around me, and I moved again without thinking, stopping by the door as I reached for the handle out of habit, pulling it open just enough to glance outside like I expected to see him there, like this was temporary, but the hallway was empty, completely still, and I closed it again, the quiet click louder than it should have been, and something in my chest tightened sharply at that, because it made it real in a way I couldn't push away anymore. And I leaned back against the door for a second, staring ahead as the thought finally settled in. Simple but heavy. He didn't stay this time. And for the first time since everything started to unravel, I understood it clearly. This wasn't just another fight. This wasn't something that would fix itself if I waited long enough. This was different, and I might have actually lost him. I didn't mean to remember it like this. Not in pieces this sharp. Not in moments that felt like they were happening again instead of just passing through my head. But once it started, it didn't stop, and suddenly I was back there, standing outside that dim bar I had no reason to care about, staring at a place that should have meant nothing. And still, I pushed the door open, stepping inside like something was already pulling me forward, and the first thing I heard was his voice, steady, rough, around the edges, not perfect but real in a way that made everything else fade out. And I remember leaning against the bar, watching him longer than I planned, longer than made sense, until the set ended and the lights shifted just enough for him to step down, and I didn't hesitate, didn't second guess it. I just walked up to him like I always did when I wanted something. "You always sing like that? Or just when I'm here?" I said, casual, like I wasn't already invested, and he barely glanced at me, wiping his hands on a towel. Like I wasn't worth more than a second of attention. "I don't know who you are," he replied, flat, uninterested, and that should have been enough to make me leave, should have killed whatever curiosity I had. But instead I smirked, leaning in just slightly. "You will." And I did come back, again and again, finding reasons that didn't matter just to see if he would look at me differently. And he didn't. Not at first. Not for a while. He kept that distance, that quiet boundary that no one else had ever held against me before, and it only made me push harder, testing, poking, refusing to accept that I wasn't already inside whatever space he kept locked away. "You're really hard to impress," I said one night, sliding a drink toward him, and he didn't even touch it, just shook his head slightly. "I'm not trying to be impressed." And something about that stayed with me. Something that made this feel less like a game and more like a challenge I couldn't walk away from. And the night I called him for the first time, it wasn't because I needed him. Not really. I just wanted to know, wanted proof. So I leaned against a wall somewhere too loud, too crowded, phone pressed to my ear as I said, "Come pick me up." Like it was nothing. Like I wasn't asking him to drop everything for me. And there was a pause, just a second, before he asked, "Where are you?" And I smiled. Even though he couldn't see it. "Does it matter?" And he didn't argue, didn't question it again. He just said, "Stay there." And he came. Of course he came, walking straight toward me like it wasn't even a decision, like it had already been made the moment I called. And I remember watching him, really watching him that time, something in my chest shifting in a way I didn't think too much about, didn't want to think too much about, because that would have made it real, and I wasn't ready for that. So instead I kept going, kept testing, kept pushing to see how far it would go, how far he would go, and every time, he didn't hesitate, didn't step back, just met me exactly where I expected him to, or maybe further. In the rain that night, I remember that clearly, the way it poured down harder than it should have, the way I stayed inside longer than necessary, watching the clock tick past the time I told him, knowing he was out there, knowing he was waiting, and when I finally stepped outside, he was exactly where I left him, soaked through, unmoving, like the rain didn't matter, like the time didn't matter, and I tilted my head slightly, almost amused. "You could have left," I said, like it was his choice, like I hadn't asked him to stay, and he looked at me, steady, unbothered. "You told me to stay," and I laughed it off back then, brushed it aside like it didn't mean anything, like it wasn't the clearest answer I would ever get, and still I didn't stop, because stopping would have meant acknowledging what this was becoming, and I wasn't ready for that. Not when it was easier to keep pretending I was in control, that I could walk away whenever I wanted, and the night I said it. It slipped out so easily I barely registered it at the time, lying back on his couch, staring at the ceiling like none of this was real. "What if we just had a kid?" I said, half laughing, like it was a joke, like it didn't carry any weight. And he didn't laugh, didn't brush it off, just turned his head slightly to look at me, eyes steady in a way that should have warned me. "Then we would," he said, simple, certain, like it wasn't a hypothetical, like it was something he had already accepted, and I didn't think about it after that, didn't treat it like it mattered, because to me, it didn't, not in the way it did to him. And now, sitting here in the silence, he left behind. Every moment plays back differently. Every word heavier than I remember, every choice clearer than it was at the time, and I press my hand against my stomach without thinking, the reality of it grounding in a way I can't escape, because it ties everything together, all of it, the calls, the rain, the words I never meant, and the ones he never forgot. And my breath catches slightly as the realization settles in fully this time, not sharp, not sudden, but crushing in its certainty. Because he didn't change, not once, not in any of it. He just kept every single thing I said like it mattered, like it was real, like it was a promise, and I was the one who treated it like a game until it became something I couldn't undo. I didn't wait long before I went looking for him. Not this time. Not after everything finally settled into something I couldn't ignore, because the silence wasn't getting easier, it wasn't fading the way I thought it would, it was getting louder, heavier, pressing in on me until sitting still felt worse than moving. And the first place I went was the most obvious one, the studio, because that was where he spent most of his time now, where everything revolved around him in a way I had once taken for granted, and I told myself it would be simple, that I would walk in, find him, say something, anything, and it would shift, not fix everything, but at least start something. But the moment I stepped inside and gave his name at the front desk, the receptionist didn't even hesitate before shaking her head slightly. "He's in a session," she said, polite but distant, like she had said it before, like she had been told exactly what to say, and I frowned slightly, because that wasn't enough. Not for me. Not this time. "I can wait," I replied, already moving past her before she could stop me. But she did, stepping in front of me just enough to block the way without making a scene. He asked not to be disturbed. And that was it. That was the first time it hit me. Not fully, but enough to sting, because this wasn't avoidance by accident. This was intentional. This was him choosing not to see me. And I stood there for a second longer than I should have, like I was waiting for something to change, for someone to say it was a mistake, but nothing did. And eventually, I stepped back, turning away before I could make it worse, before I could stand there long enough for it to become embarrassing. And if this had been before, if this had happened even a few weeks ago, I would have left it at that, would have told myself it wasn't worth it, that I didn't need to chase someone who clearly didn't want to be found, that I had more pride than that. But the thought barely lasted a second before it fell apart, because this wasn't the same, I wasn't the same, and walking away didn't feel like strength anymore. It felt like losing something I wasn't ready to lose. So I came back the next day, and the day after that, different times, different excuses, telling myself maybe I had just missed him, maybe the timing was off, but it wasn't. It never was, because every time, the answer was the same, polite, controlled, final, and by the third time, I stopped pretending it was coincidence, stopped pretending this wasn't exactly what it looked like, and I stepped outside the building instead of leaving completely, lingering just far enough away that I could see the entrance without being obvious, and I told myself I would wait just a little longer, just enough to catch him on his way out, and minutes turned into an hour without me noticing. The sun shifting slightly overhead while I stayed in the same place, my attention fixed on the doors. Like something would change if I just watched long enough. And when he finally walked out, I knew immediately, even before I saw his face clearly, because no one else moved like that. No one else carried that same quiet certainty, and my chest tightened before I could stop it, my body already moving before my thoughts caught up. "Damien." I called out, my voice louder than I intended, cutting through the space between us, and for a second, just a second, he paused, his steps slowing like he had heard me, like he had recognized it. And hope hit too fast, too sharp, because I thought that was enough, thought that was all it would take. But then he kept walking, not faster, not like he was avoiding me in an obvious way, just forward, like I hadn't said anything at all, and something in my chest dropped hard enough that it almost made me stop, almost made me turn around and leave before I embarrassed myself further. But I didn't, because I couldn't, not this time, and I caught up to him. In a few quick steps, reaching out just enough to stop him, my fingers brushing his sleeve before I pulled back, unsure, hesitant in a way I had never been with him before. "Can we talk?" I asked, and my voice didn't sound like mine, softer, less certain, like I was asking for something instead of expecting it. And he looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment, everything else faded out, because it had always been like that, just me and him, no matter where we were, no matter what was happening around us. But this time, something was different, something in his expression that didn't shift the way it used to, didn't soften, didn't close the distance between us. There's nothing to talk about, he said. Calm, even, like it was a fact instead of a choice. And the words hit harder than I expected, sharper than anything he had said before, because they weren't angry, weren't defensive, they were final. And I shook my head immediately, because that wasn't true. It couldn't be. There is, I said, stepping closer without thinking. I didn't mean what I said. And the moment the words left my mouth, I realized how weak they sounded, how small they were compared to everything that had already happened. And he didn't react, didn't argue, just watched me for a second longer before shaking his head slightly. You did, he said quietly, and that was worse, because he wasn't accusing me, wasn't throwing it back at me. He was just stating it, like it was something he had already accepted, something he wasn't trying to change anymore. And I swallowed hard, because I didn't know how to argue with that, didn't know how to undo something that had already settled into place like this. Damien, please, I started, but he stepped back before I could finish, creating distance instead of closing it. And that alone was enough to make something in me tighten again, because it was new, it was wrong, it was the exact opposite of what he had always done. You should go home, he said, his voice still calm, still steady, but carrying something underneath it that I couldn't reach anymore, and I stared at him, because I didn't understand how he got here, didn't understand how he could stand there like this, like I was someone he could walk away from. I'm not leaving, I said, the words coming out before I could think about them. And for a second, something flickered in his expression, something brief and unreadable, before it disappeared just as quickly. Then wait, he replied, like it didn't matter to him either way, like my choice didn't change anything. And then he walked past me, not stopping, not looking back, just continuing on like this was already over, like I wasn't something he needed to stay for anymore. And I stood there for a moment, frozen, watching him disappear into the distance until I couldn't see him anymore, and the urge to leave came back stronger this time, louder, telling me this was enough, that I had tried, that I had done more than I should have, that I could still walk away with some part of myself intact. But I didn't move, because that voice didn't matter anymore, not compared to the one that had been building underneath it, the one that had been getting louder with every step he took away from me, the one that finally settled into something clear, something I couldn't ignore anymore. And I turned back toward the building, toward the place I knew he would return to eventually. And instead of leaving, I walked over to the side of the entrance, leaning against the wall like I had nowhere else to be, like I was willing to stay there as long as it took. Because for the first time since all of this started, I wasn't thinking about pride, wasn't thinking about what this looked like, wasn't thinking about anything except the one thing that mattered now, the one thing I couldn't afford to lose. And as the hours stretched on and the sky slowly shifted toward evening, I stayed exactly where I was, waiting, because this time I wasn't testing him anymore, I was choosing him, and I wasn't leaving without him. I don't know how long I stayed there before he came back, long enough for the light to shift, for the air to cool, for the ache in my legs to settle into something dull and constant that I stopped noticing after a while. And at some point I leaned back against the wall just to keep myself steady, my hand resting unconsciously against my stomach like it had started doing more often now, grounding in a way that made everything feel heavier instead of lighter. And I told myself I would leave if it got too late, if it became pointless, if he didn't come back at all. But I didn't move, didn't even consider it. Seriously, because leaving felt worse than staying, worse than waiting, worse than standing here knowing he might walk past me again without stopping. And when the doors finally opened and I saw him step out, I knew immediately, even before he noticed me, because I had been watching for him for hours, tracking every movement, every shadow, every person who walked through that entrance hoping it would be him. And this time it was. And my chest tightened in a way that made it hard to breathe, not from panic, not exactly, but from something heavier, something closer to anticipation mixed with fear, because I didn't know how this would go, didn't know if he would stop, didn't know if I had already lost him completely. And for a second, I just stood there, watching him take a few steps forward before his gaze lifted slightly and found me. And everything stilled, not around us, but between us, like the space we were standing in had narrowed down to just that moment, just that distance. And I saw it then, the flicker of something in his expression, not surprise, not quite, but recognition, awareness, something that told me he hadn't expected me to still be here. And I pushed myself off the wall before I could hesitate, before I could think too much about it. Because if I did, I might not move at all. And I stepped toward him, stopping just short of where I would have before, leaving space this time, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know if I was allowed to close it anymore. I'm still here, I said, and my voice came out quieter than I expected, rougher from disuse, but steady enough that it didn't break. And he looked at me for a second longer, his expression unreadable in a way that made it harder to hold on to whatever confidence I thought I had. I can see that, he replied, calm, neutral, like it didn't mean anything more than the obvious, and I swallowed. Because that wasn't enough. That couldn't be all this was, not after everything, and I shook my head slightly, forcing myself to keep going. I'm not leaving. I added, the words firmer this time, more certain, and something in his gaze shifted again, subtle but there, like he was weighing that against something else, something internal I couldn't see, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to make my chest tighten again, because I didn't know what he was going to say, didn't know if this was where he would turn away again. But he didn't. He stayed exactly where he was, and that alone was enough to keep me standing there, enough to push me forward just a little more. I know what I said. I continued, the words slower now, more deliberate, because I couldn't afford to rush this, couldn't afford to lose control of it again. And I know it hurt you. And his expression didn't change, didn't soften or harden, just remained steady in that same way that had become harder to read than anything else. And I let out a small breath, my fingers curling slightly at my sides as I forced myself to keep going. But I was wrong, I said, and the words felt heavier than anything else I had said to him before, because this time, they weren't thrown in frustration, weren't used to push him away. They were just true. And for a second, something in his gaze flickered again, something small but real, before it settled back into that same calm distance. About what? He asked, and the question was simple, but it landed harder than I expected, because it meant I had to say it, had to put it into words instead of just feeling it, and I hesitated for half a second before answering, because once I said it, there was no taking it back, no softening it. About you, I said quietly, about everything, and the silence that followed felt different this time, not empty, not distant, but fragile, like something could shift either way depending on what I said next, and I took a step closer without thinking, closing just a little more of the space between us. You didn't make this happen. I continued, my voice steady despite the way my chest tightened with every word. I did, and his gaze sharpened slightly at that, not in anger, not in accusation, but in attention, like he was actually listening now instead of just hearing me, and that gave me just enough to keep going. Just enough to not stop halfway through like I might have before. I asked for all of it, I said, and my hand moved again without me realizing it, resting against my stomach briefly before falling back to my side. I just didn't take it seriously when you did. And this time, he didn't respond right away, didn't fill the space with something controlled or careful. He just looked at me, really looked, and I felt it, the weight of that attention in a way I hadn't before. Because it wasn't the same as it used to be. It wasn't automatic. It wasn't something I could rely on without question. It was something I had to earn back, something I wasn't sure I had the right to anymore. And I exhaled slowly, because there was one more thing, one thing I hadn't said yet, one thing that mattered more than everything else, and I forced myself to say it before I could lose the nerve. I don't want to lose you. And the words came out softer than everything else, quieter, but they carried more weight than anything I had said so far. Because they weren't about blame or explanation, they were about choice, about what I was willing to do now instead of what I had done before. And for a moment, nothing happened, no immediate reaction, no shift I could hold on to, just that same quiet space between us. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something in his expression changed, not enough to call it softness, not enough to say it was forgiveness, but enough that it wasn't completely closed off anymore. And he took a small breath. Like he was considering something, like he was letting the words settle instead of pushing them away. That doesn't fix what happened, he said finally, and his voice was still calm, still steady, but there was something different in it now, something less final, less distant, and I nodded immediately, because I wasn't expecting it to, wasn't asking for that. I know, I said. I'm not asking you to forget it. And I hesitated for a second before adding, quieter now, more honest than anything else I had said so far. I'm asking for a chance to make it right. And the silence that followed wasn't as heavy as before, wasn't as empty. It was something else now, something uncertain, something that could still go either way. And for the first time since all of this started, I didn't feel like I was standing on the edge of something breaking. I felt like I was standing in front of something that hadn't been decided yet. And as I looked at him, really looked at him the way I should have from the beginning, I realized that whatever happened next wasn't going to be given to me the way it had been before. It was something I was going to have to earn, one step at a time, and for the first time, I was ready to do that. I thought it would take longer to fix what I broke. Thought there would be more distance, more resistance, more time spent standing on opposite sides of something we didn't know how to cross. But it didn't happen like that. Not exactly. Because even when Damien kept his distance at first, even when he didn't reach for me the way he used to, there was still something there. Something steady that never really disappeared. And maybe that was why it was easier than I expected to find our way back. Not all at once. Not in some perfect moment, but in small steps that started to add up before I realized it. And the first time it shifted, really shifted, was when I saw him again after that night. When the silence between us wasn't as heavy, when he didn't walk away, didn't shut me out completely, just stood there, listening, and I didn't waste it this time. Didn't hide behind half answers or excuses. I was wrong, I said, the words coming out steady, even though my chest tightened as soon as I said them. And he didn't interrupt, didn't dismiss it, just watched me, waiting, and I forced myself to keep going. About you, about everything. And there was a brief pause, something shifting in his expression, not soft, not forgiving, but not closed either, and I took a step closer, slower this time, giving him space to move if he wanted to. You didn't make this happen, I added, my voice quieter now, but more certain. I did. And this time he reacted, just slightly, his gaze sharpening. Like he was actually hearing me instead of just listening out of habit, and for a second, neither of us spoke, the air between us fragile but no longer suffocating. And when he finally exhaled, it wasn't the same as before, not distant, not final, just careful. That doesn't fix what happened, he said, and I nodded immediately, because I knew that. I wasn't trying to pretend it did. I know, I replied, holding his gaze this time instead of looking away. I'm not asking you to forget it. And my fingers curled slightly at my side before I added, quieter but more honest than anything else. I just don't want to lose you. And that was the moment something changed, not dramatically, not in a way that erased everything that came before, but enough that I felt it. The way the distance between us didn't feel as final anymore. The way he didn't step back when I moved closer, and after that, things didn't go back to the way they were. They moved forward, slower, more deliberate, but still forward. And it was strange at first, learning how to be around him again without falling into old patterns, noticing the way he didn't automatically reach for me, didn't fill every silence, didn't carry everything on his own anymore, and, for the first time, I didn't expect him to, didn't push him to. I just stayed, matched his pace instead of trying to control it, and the more I did, the easier it became, the pauses between us less awkward, the conversations more real, less about avoiding things and more about actually saying them. And there were moments, small ones, where it felt like the beginning again, like when his hand brushed against mine and didn't pull away, or when he stood a little closer than before without thinking. And this time, I didn't take it for granted, didn't assume it would always be there no matter what I did. I noticed it, held on to it without demanding more, and maybe that was why it worked, why it didn't fall apart the way it had before, because this time, I wasn't waiting for him to carry everything. I was meeting him there, step by step, and somewhere along the way, without a clear moment to mark it, the distance faded. Not completely, not all at once, but enough that being next to him felt natural again instead of uncertain. And when our child was born, it didn't feel like something overwhelming or out of control the way I had feared. It felt right, like everything had been leading to that moment without me realizing it. And I remember sitting there, holding them for the first time, my mind quiet in a way it hadn't been in a long time. And when I looked up, Damien was already watching, his expression softer than I had ever seen it, but still the same at its core, steady, certain, and he stayed. Of course he did. He stepped back from everything else without hesitation, choosing to be there, not just for me but for us, adjusting his life in a way that felt intentional, not forced, and I noticed it more than I ever had before. The way he made space for us instead of fitting us around everything else. And maybe that was when it really settled in. The difference between what I had grown up with and what we were building now. Something stable, something present, something that didn't disappear when things got difficult. And one night, when everything was quiet and we were lying there with nothing pulling us apart. I found myself asking the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind for longer than I wanted to admit. Why did you stay? I murmured, turning slightly to look at him. Back then, why didn't you just leave? And he didn't answer right away, just tightened his arms slightly around me. Grounding, familiar. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, thoughtful. Maybe it's instinct, he said, and I frowned slightly. Waiting, and he continued after a second, like a wolf. And there was something almost certain in the way he said it, like it wasn't just a comparison. When it chooses someone, it doesn't change its mind. And I let out a soft breath at that, something between a laugh and something else, because it sounded exactly like him, simple but absolute. And I shook my head slightly, leaning back into him as I closed my eyes. That sounds like you, I said quietly. And he didn't argue, didn't deny it, just stayed there, steady as always. And for a moment, everything felt still in the best way, not empty, not uncertain, just complete. And even now, there are times when his intensity still catches me off guard, when the way he wants, the way he stays, feels like too much for a second, but I don't pull away anymore. I don't fight it, because I understand it. Now, understand him, and more importantly, I understand what it means to have something like this and choose it anyway. And if I'm being honest, if I strip everything down to the simplest truth, I don't regret any of it. Not the mistakes, not the parts that hurt, because all of it led here, to something I almost lost before I even realized what it was. And now that I do, now that I finally see it clearly, I know one thing for certain. Choosing him was never the mistake. The only mistake was not realizing sooner just how lucky I was.